Introductory quote from Wernher von Braun. It is commonly believed that man will fly directly from the Earth to the moon, but to do this, we would require a vehicle of such gigantic proportions that it would prove an economic impossibility. It would have to develop sufficient speed to penetrate the atmosphere and overcome the Earth's gravity, and having traveled all the way to the moon, it must still have enough fuel to land safely and make the return trip to Earth. Furthermore, in order to give the expedition a margin of safety, we would not use one ship alone, but a minimum of 3. Each rocket ship would be taller than New York City's Empire State Building, almost a quarter-mile high, and weigh about 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons. Wernher von Braun, the father of the Apollo space program, writing in Conquest of the Moon. Dave, that's staggering, isn't it?
It is indeed, and interestingly enough, it was fairly recently NASA, with their latest supposed moon mission that they proposed, which wasn't even going to involve landing on the moon. It was going to just basically send a capsule out there with a few guys to sort of hover in fixed lunar orbit for observational purposes. It wasn't even going to involve, the landing, which was the most technologically challenging part of the alleged Apollo missions. And for that project, they were talking about multiple rocket launches. It was either 2 or 3 launches for each mission, like the rover, the remote controlled rover that they were going to send up. They were going to send on on a separate launch. Whereas back in the '60s, we were able to just fold those things up and tuck them in the cargo bay and bring them along.
David, so ridiculous.
But nowadays, now they've come full circle, and now they're saying that indeed, it would require multiple launches just to get men into lunar orbit, not even onto the surface of the moon, but just out into lunar orbit would require multiple launches. So, there was apparently that one period there in the late 60s, early 70s where none of those rules applied, and we were able to just kind of wing it, but...
That's right.
But every other...
It's as though the laws of physics were suspended for that interval of time.
Yeah, it really is, and... one of the most amazing things to me about the whole question of whether the moon launches were hoaxed or not is the fact that NASA has actually admitted at least 3 times that I'm aware of that we did not go to the moon in the 60s. And, I mean, not explicitly, but basically they have made that admission, and at least 3 times. And this is all in my series of articles. There are links to the press releases and to the, news reports, and there are, reproductions of artist conceptions that NASA has put out about what kind of technology would be required to go back, quote unquote, go back to the moon. And on 3 separate occasions, they have said, on one occasion, they said that we do not currently have the technology to deal with the lunar dust problem, and that a whole slew of advanced technology will have to be developed so that, and basically what they've talked about, and again, I have these illustrations, on in my post, and what they've said is that they're going to have to create like sort of a spacesuit that remains like docked to the outside of the of the rover and of the lunar module, so that basically the astronauts would sort of step in through the back of these suits and then step away from the capsule, and it would seal, and then when they re-enter the capsule, they would reverse that procedure and sort of back up and dock to the capsule, and then somehow through an airlock or whatever it is, re-enter the capsule, so that the spacesuits would never re-enter the lunar modules. The reason being that they said that the dust would just pose a huge problem for the electronics and everything else, all the working and moving parts, and and that they don't have the capability to deal with that dust, so they have to create this technology that would allow dust-free, walks on the moon, so to speak. But back in the 60s, they were out driving around in dune buggies, kicking up, big old rooster tails full of dust, dust flying everywhere, and, going in and out of the capsules with no airlocks or anything else. And apparently wasn't a problem then. But NASA has explicitly said that now, 40 plus years after the fact, we do not have the technology to deal with lunar dust, and if we're serious about going to the moon, we have to develop that technology. So that was one example. On another occasion, they announced that we do not currently have any suitable material for building spacesuits that would withstand the temperature extremes and just the extreme environment of the moon, and that any materials currently known, whether natural or synthetic materials, would not hold up, and they would dry out, crack, whatnot, and there's currently no materials that are suitable for building spacesuits that will survive the extreme, conditions on the moon. And they can announce stuff like this with a straight face without even acknowledging, and the amazing thing to me is that never does a reporter stand up and raise their hand and say, hey, wait a minute. How did we do it back in the 60s if you're saying that even now we don't have the technology to do it, And the third one that they have talked about is the radiation problem, which they've called a showstopper. And again, I have artist conceptions direct from NASA of these elaborate technological shields that would have to be built on the surface of the moon just to allow the astronauts to to land on and work on the surface of the moon for various periods of time. So we have at least three things that we do not now have, and this is all direct. This is not me saying this. This is NASA talking heads who have said that we simply do not have the radiation protection technology, we do not have the spacesuit technology, and we do not have the technology to deal with the lunar dust. All three of those are major hurdles that have to be resolved before we can go back to the moon. And those are just absolutely startling admissions that, here they are coming out and publicly saying that, no, we don't have the technology to do this. 45 years ago, yes, 45 years ago we had it, but now we don't.
And of course, you're being sarcastic when you say that, because they don't insist they did have it then. They just fake it. And the brain trust that passes for the news media today lets them get away with it.
I know, it's amazing. No one questions it. No one questions the just extreme, lack of logic there in coming out and saying, well, we're going to have to develop all this totally new technology, and I'm thinking, why not just pull out those Saturn V plans? Why don't you just dust off those plans and slap a couple of those together?
Right, dust them off.
Why are we reinventing the wheel when we have a vehicle that not only made it, but it had a perfect safety record, something that we can't even match now. Why in the world would you want to reinvent the wheel when you have the technology that performed beautifully? Perfectly. Not a single loss of life, you had the Apollo 13 nonsense, which was all for dramatic effect, but no one died. All those capsules made it back. Perfect safety record. We landed there every time except for the 13, and even they made it to the moon and back. So why do we need to come up with billions and billions of dollars of brand new technology when we have plans, in our files that for equipment that we know for a fact works with 100% reliability? Why?
I know, David. It's embarrassing that the American people are so dumb, so dull, so thick-headed that we don't have the ability to see through something as transparent as this.
It really is. I mean, I refer to it in my articles as like the adult version of believing in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. Because, I mean, if you really subject it to any kind of critical analysis, it's just as ridiculous. You know, I mean, it really is. And that's a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. But, you know, facts are facts. And, you know, the more you dissect it, the deeper you dive into it, the more absurd it becomes, really.
Yeah, Winston Wu, who's a student of these kinds of absurd claims, has observed that this is the only field in which technology has regressed rather than moved forward.
That's true. I mean, yeah, if you look at the field of consumer technology, I mean, you know, 1960, when the first... you know, when the first Apollo, you know, capsule supposedly landed on the moon to great fanfare, you know, a full slate of consumer electronics in your home would have been like a, you know, 13-channel black and white TV, you know, and a big black phone that weighed like 20 pounds. You know, I mean, that was about all. I don't even know if like pocket calculators were being widely marketed at that time. And I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, we've just come light years, just absolutely light years in the last 4.5 decades. And in every other, you know, whether it's, you know, automotive technology, you know, whatever it is, any branch of technology that you look at has just advanced so far. You know, I mean, the 1960s was like the dark ages, you know, for all intents and purposes, except for in the field of space exploration, in which, you know, we made our most amazing accomplishments that remain to this day the most technologically complex accomplishments that any nation has ever even attempted to pull off, you know. I mean, well beyond what we're doing now. And I don't know that you know, the average person even realizes how much more technologically difficult a moon landing is than just putting a space shuttle into low Earth orbit, you know, which is all that we've done for the last like 40 years. That's the most we've been able to accomplish. And you know, I think a lot of people kind of have the impression that you know, it's not that big of a jump. You know, but it is. It's huge. I mean, it's just absolutely, you know, it's just light years beyond what we're doing now.
Well, I'm just fascinated and stunned at the same time.
Reluctant to give up. You know, I mean, it's the greatest technological achievement of the 20th century, right? I mean, it's constantly touted as that. And also, there's the fact that it's such a huge lie, and this, you know, maybe for a lot of people maybe operates not even on a conscious level, but there's the fact that acknowledging that our government could be capable of pulling off such a huge lie in front of the entire world and, you know, pull the wool over the people's eyes so thoroughly, and, you know, acknowledging that then opens the door to, well, you know, if they lied about that, what else have they lied about? Did they lie about the Kennedy assassination? Did they lie about 9/11? Did they lie about Waco? Did they, you know? And once you crack that door open, you know, it's life changing. You know, I mean, it's a life alter your entire perception of the world and how it operates, and you know, what our country's place in it is and whatnot. And that's very difficult. Those are.
The technology to fake it anyone who has seen Capricorn 1 realizes how absurd it is to make that claim.
Yeah, they didn't really fake it all that well either, you know.
All things considered.
Yeah, you know, I mean, some of the video footage is kind of comical, really, and the photographs are just absolutely absurd. I mean, the quality of the photographs is
well, what's amazing about them is they're so good, you know, and the backgrounds are just as precisely defined as the foreground, which Jay Wiedner pointed out as a sign of using front screen projection, that they were all faked. And, of course, Jack White, who's a legendary photo analyst who's now deceased, had done a massive studies of the moon landing, found all kinds of anomalies. You have rovers, but there are no tracks that show how they got to the position they're in. You have light that is from two different sources. You have all kinds of things like this there. And so that's the very first of that list of 9, the work on the Apollo moon photographs.
Yeah, absolutely. They're just littered with anomalies, and even above and beyond all that, they're just, the photos themselves are just physically impossible. You know, I mean, they're just not humanly possible. You know, I mean, I'm a photographer myself, and you know, I'm a little older than I like to admit, and you know, I have experience working with manually operated cameras where you have to set, you know, manual exposure, manual focus, and obviously you have to frame it manually, and you know, all of those things were impossible. They didn't have viewfinders on those cameras. You know? They
didn't even have viewfinders. They were mounted right on the spacesuit, so they couldn't even focus. And would you believe, nevertheless, Dave, every one of those photographs is perfectly framed?
And they're wearing helmets with visors and pressurized gloves, and you know, all of this restricting, you know, restricts your field of vision, restricts your manual dexterity and whatnot. And you know, I got into it with one of the debunkers once about the photos, and I challenged him. I said, well, you show me then. You show me how it can be done. You know, you put on a motorcycle, you know, get a manually operated camera, an old, you know, 1960s vintage camera, and strap it on your chest, and put on a motorcycle helmet, and put on some nice big heavy winter gloves, and, you know, fix the camera to your chest so that you can't look through the viewfinder, and you just have to gas on the focus, and you have to gas on the exposure, and you have to gas on how the shot's framed. And you go out and you shoot a few rolls of film like that, and let me know how that works out for you. You know, because I guarantee you what you're going to get is a bunch of garbage, a bunch of completely unusable, unfocused, poorly framed, poorly exposed.
Worse than that, Dave, the cosmic rays would make havoc with a photographic plate. I mean, you couldn't get any photographs up there. And then the extreme variation, you know, between light and dark, 250 above to 250 below, it's just ridiculous. That's one of the points NASA was making now to explain why we can't get there. We can't go now because the spacesuits couldn't handle the difference in the temperatures. Well, imagine the cameras.
I know, and the film stock, you know, this is like standard 1960s film stock, you know, not very high tech. Not very high tech, to say the least.
This isn't very far from the days when
very temperature sensitive, very radiation sensitive.
Yes.
And they're shooting up there in the moon, 250 degrees above, you know, 250 degrees below zero, massive radiation spikes.
It's incredible, Dave. And there are people out there who still believe we went to the moon.
I know, it's astonishing, but you know, what can I say? 20 years ago, I would have laughed at this radio show. These people are crazy, you know. How could you pull off something like that and keep it secret for so long? And you know, but you know, if you really look at it, it's really irrefutable. I mean, it's impossible to believe in it. The deeper you dig into it, it just becomes intellectually impossible to accept. Was the Dutch moon rock incident where it was revealed like 4 or 5 years ago that this moon rock that had been very proudly displayed for decades turned out to be like a piece of petrified wood.
Yes, isn't that unbelievable?
Yeah, they're like giving out fake moon rocks to other countries, you know. And then it turned out that the vast majority of the ones that they gave out have disappeared completely, and nobody even knows where they are. You know, these priceless, irreplaceable artifacts of the greatest technological achievement in the history of mankind, and yet, you know, all of the vast majority of the rocks have gone missing. You know, the records of the flights have gone missing. The original plans have gone, you know, I mean, that's just so absurd. That, you know, all of that stuff should be in temperature-controlled vaults in the Smithsonian or something for, preserved for all time if it really was the greatest technological achievement that mankind has ever accomplished. How could they not, how could they not very carefully preserve, all of the evidence and all of the artifacts, and it's just, again, it's absurd. Amazing things to me that I learned was about the liftoff engines on the lunar module. Everything about the lunar module was just absolutely absurd. These things are like some framework wrapped in like mylar or aluminum foil or something.
Yeah.
They're comical. They really are. But one of the most amazing things to me was what I found out about the liftoff engine. They had two engines. One was the landing engine, which provided reverse thrust so that it didn't just crash land on the moon. That supposedly gave it the ability to hover and set down gently. And then there was a second engine, which was for liftoff. What was going to get them off the moon and back to the command module so that they could then return to Earth. And amazingly enough, these engines used what they call hypergolic, I believe it is, fuel, which is highly corrosive to such an extent that the engines can really only be fired once. Once they've been fired up, they corrode and they can't be reused again. So they actually, according to the official story, they sent these people to the moon with their only way out, the only way back, their only ticket back to Earth was depending on this engine that had never been tested. And I don't mean just like never tested under the conditions which it was going to operate, which it obviously wasn't because they didn't know, and even if they did know, there's no way on Earth to replicate the conditions on the moon, So not only was it not tested under the actual working conditions, but they were actually never fired at all. Never even test started in the factory to make sure that the damn thing, that particular unit even worked properly. Can you imagine flying 236,000 miles to a different planetary body, knowing that your only way back is an engine that they couldn't even test run even once to even verify that the thing even started up, let alone that it did what it was supposed to do in the conditions under which it was supposed to do it, So these people, they fly out to the moon, they land, they spend, 3, 4, 5 days, whatever it is, the missions were varying lengths, and the whole time there, they have no idea when it's time to go, when they push that ignition button, whether anything's actually going to even happen, It's just,
well,
I just, for the life of me, it's just so absurd to think that they would actually do that, It's just
even as a form of fakery.
Yeah, it's just you want me to believe that these guys went all the way to the moon without even knowing that these engines even worked at all, let alone worked to do what they were supposed to do as far as getting the module back up into lunar orbit,